In the heart of the sun-drenched village of Urumba, where the palm trees whispered secrets and the rivers sang old songs, lived a girl named Zuri, as beautiful as a blooming hibiscus, but with a tongue sharper than a blacksmith's blade. From the moment she learned to speak, Zuri used her words not to bless, but to bite. She mocked the old, belittled the young, and laughed in the face of wisdom. "Your head looks like a cooking pot left in the rain," she'd say to one elder. To another, "Is your back bent from age, or just shame?" Her voice rang through the village like a drum of trouble, always loud, never kind. Mothers pulled their children close when she passed, elders shook their heads, and even the bravest men avoided her path. Yet Zuri walked tall, proud of her mouth, thinking it made her powerful. What she didn't know was that the very mouth she was so proud of would one day become the reason her pride shattered like clay in a storm. But for now, she ruled with her words, feared not for her fists, but for her tongue. Zuri's mother, Mama Kemi, was a woman carved from patience and sorrow, with eyes that had seen too many sunrises and a heart that had carried too many burdens. Each day, she watched her daughter throw sharp words like stones in the village, and each night, she sat by the fire, whispering prayers into the smoke, hoping the gods would touch Zuri's heart. "My daughter," she would say, her voice trembling like dry leaves in Harmattan wind, "a mouth without a gate will one day let in destruction." But Zuri only laughed, tossing her head like a peacock, proud and untamed. "Mama," she scoffed, "words are just wind. Let the weak cry. I speak truth." Mama Kemi's heart broke a little more with every insult Zuri hurled, not just at strangers, but at her own blood. "You call me old," Mama once said, "but these wrinkles raised you. You mock my hands, yet they fed you." Still, Zuri would not listen. Her pride was a wall too tall for reason to climb. And though Mama Kemi was tired, she never stopped warning, because she knew the storm was coming, and no shelter made of arrogance would stand when the winds of consequence finally blew. It was a bright morning when the village market came alive with its usual colors and chaos. Traders shouting prices, children chasing goats, and elders gathered under the old baobab tree. But the moment Zuri's footsteps echoed on the dusty ground, silence crept like a shadow. Women clutched their baskets tighter, and men lowered their voices. Zuri strolled in with her chin high and her words loaded like arrows. "Your tomatoes look like they've been crying all night," she sneered at a poor old vendor. "Is that fish or a forgotten curse?" She asked another, laughing so loudly that even the birds scattered from the rooftops. Her mouth didn't spare anyone. Not the crippled basket weaver, not the widow with missing teeth, not even the chief's son whose stutter became her entertainment. Each insult she threw was followed by laughter from a few cowardly onlookers, too afraid to challenge her, yet too entertained to stop her. The market that once rang with joyful barter now echoed with her venom. But what Zuri didn't see, or refused to see, were the eyes that began to turn cold, the hearts that grew tired of her tongue, and the whispers rising like smoke. She thinks she's untouchable, but even the loudest thunder meets silence one day. The sun was beginning to tilt west when the village square filled with excitement for the annual harvest festival. Drums rolled, dancers leapt, and laughter swirled in the air like sweet perfume. But amidst the colors and rhythm, a stranger stepped into Urumba. Tall, cloaked in earth-toned robes, with eyes deep like ancient wells and a silence that spoke louder than any voice. His name was Obesai, though none in the village knew it yet. He walked with the calm of a man who had seen storms and learned to dance in the rain. Curious eyes followed him, whispers trailing behind his every step. But not Zuri, oh no. As soon as she saw him standing alone, surveying the celebration, her tongue leapt like fire to dry grass. "Look at this one," she laughed, loud and mocking, dressed like a prophet, staring like a goat that lost its way. A few laughed nervously, but most watched Obesai. He didn't frown. He didn't shout. He simply smiled, slow and steady, like a lion watching a noisy bird. And then, with a voice like distant thunder, he said, Even the fiercest mouth can learn silence when it meets truth. The crowd went still. Zuri blinked, surprised. No one had ever answered her like that. But pride swelled in her chest. And in that moment, the fire met water, though neither knew yet which would win. The festival air grew thick with curiosity as the villagers gathered beneath the baobab tree, drawn not by music or dance, but by the strange tension between Zuri and the quiet stranger. Obesai, still calm, stepped forward and spoke with a voice that carried weight, not volume. "Since your tongue is your pride," he said, eyes fixed on Zuri, "let's see if it can endure the truth it so easily throws." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small gourd carved with ancient symbols. "This," he said, "contains the water of bitterness, brewed with herbs that carry the sting of shame. For every insult you speak, you must take a sip. Let your mouth earn what it spills." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Zuri laughed, tossing her braids back. "Is that all?" she scoffed. "A little game with a bitter drink? I'll drink your whole gourd and still speak better than this entire village." The people watched with bated breath. No one had ever dared to challenge Zuri, and now, here stood a man who not only challenged her, but dared her in front of the entire village. She accepted, of course, too proud to step back, not knowing that this was not just a game. It was the beginning of her undoing. The crowd circled tightly now, silent as the grave, eyes darting between Zuri's proud smirk and Obesai's calm gaze. The gourd sat between them, dark and full, waiting like a trap laid by fate. Obesai spoke first, his tone soft but sharp. "Zuri," he said, "what do you think of your father's hunting skills?" Without a pause, Zuri scoffed and rolled her eyes. "Ha! That man couldn't catch a rabbit if it was tied to his foot. He chases shadows and calls them meat." The crowd stirred. Her father stood at the edge, face sinking like the setting sun. Obesai simply nodded and offered her the gourd. "Drink," he said. Zuri snatched it, lifted it high, and swallowed without fear. But the moment the bitter liquid touched her tongue, her face twisted. Her eyes blinked fast, her throat burned, and her pride cracked just a little. She coughed, but forced a grin. "That's it?" she said, though her voice was less certain now. But the bitterness hadn't just stayed on her tongue. It had started sinking deeper into her chest, where truth begins to echo. And still, the challenge had only just begun. Zuri's laughter echoed as she wiped the last of the bitter taste from her lips. "Is that all you've got?" she mocked, confident that her pride would see her through. But Obesai's eyes remained calm, undisturbed. "The game has just begun, Zuri," he said softly. "What do you think of the village healer, Mama Tani?" Zuri didn't even hesitate. "Mama Tani? She's so old, she can't remember if her wrinkles came from wisdom or from all the bad advice she gave." The crowd winced, but Zuri's voice rang out like a war drum, loud and untamed. Obesai's response was simple. He pushed the gourd toward her again. "Drink." With a defiant sneer, Zuri took the gourd and gulped down the bitter water. This time, the taste burned deeper, sharper. It wasn't just bitterness. It was the taste of her own words biting back. The crowd held their breath, watching her struggle to hold on to her defiance. With each insult, the gourd was refilled, and each gulp made her stronger, yet weaker at the same time. Zuri's pride was starting to falter, her tongue heavy with the weight of truth, her spirit shaken with each sip she took. It was no longer just a game. The arrows of her own making were now piercing her heart, and for the first time, she wondered if she had miscalculated. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the village, Zuri's once bright spirit began to fade. Her usual sharp tongue was no longer the weapon it had been. Each word she spoke now seemed to carry the weight of her own regret. Obesai's calm gaze never wavered as he spoke again. "Now, Zuri, what do you think of your own mother, the woman who raised you with love and patience?" Zuri hesitated for the first time, her tongue faltering. She had insulted so many, but this felt different. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, The gentle hands that had held her when she was small, the tired eyes that still tried to warn her. But pride, thick like a vine, pushed her to speak. "She's too soft," Zuri muttered, her voice shaky. "She's weak." The words were barely out of her mouth when Obesai pushed the gourd toward her again. This time, Zuri's hands trembled as she reached for it. She had no more mocking words left. She drank, but it tasted like ash, like her very soul was being scorched. The crowd, once fascinated by her defiance, now watched in silence. Zuri set the gourd down, her lips dry, her spirit broken. For the first time in her life, she felt the sting of her own words, and with it, an unfamiliar silence filled the space where her pride once stood. The laughter, the insults, the bravado, all seemed to vanish into the heavy, suffocating quiet. She looked up at Obesai, and in his eyes, she saw no mockery, no judgment, only a quiet understanding. And in that moment, Zuri realized that silence was louder than any words she had ever spoken. As the final drops of the bitter gourd dripped from her lips, Zuri sat there, motionless, her face pale and her eyes wide with realization. The laughter and pride that once filled her heart had evaporated, replaced by an emptiness so deep it made her feel like a stranger in her own body. She had mocked her father, belittled the healer, and insulted the very woman who had given her life, and now her words had come back to tear at her. She looked around at the villagers, their faces no longer filled with fear, but with pity. Pity for the girl who thought her words could never hurt her. Obesai stood beside her, his gaze steady, his silence louder than any rebuke. "Do you understand now, Zuri?" he asked, his voice gentle yet firm. Zuri's chest tightened, and for the first time, she felt the sting of true humility. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I was wrong," she said, the words coming slowly, like stones from a riverbed. "I thought words were power, but now I see they are chains." Obesai smiled, his eyes softening. Words have the power to heal and destroy, but when used recklessly, they can leave scars that last longer than any wound. Zuri stood up, her legs shaking but her heart steadier than it had ever been. "I will speak only kindness from now on," she promised, her voice filled with sincerity. The villagers, who had watched her with silent judgment, now nodded, some with smiles, others with tears. Zuri had learned her lesson. The girl with the sharp tongue had been humbled, not by force, but by the truth that her own words had finally taught her. The days that followed were different. The vibrant, mocking Zuri who once filled the air with insults and laughter now walked quietly through the village, her head bowed not in shame, but in quiet reflection. Her words, once sharp and cutting, were now soft, like a warm breeze on a cool morning. She greeted the elders with respect, praised the children for their small victories, and spoke with kindness to the very people she had once scorned. Her mother, Mama Kemi, who had prayed for this day, watched her daughter with tears in her eyes. Zuri no longer spoke to be heard, but to heal, to lift others up. The market, once tense and fearful when Zuri passed, now buzzed with the sounds of laughter and stories. The yam seller smiled at her, the butcher laughed with her, and even the butcher's dog wagged its tail when Zuri stopped to pet it. Zuri had learned that words, when used with love, were not just tools of destruction, but seeds of growth. She became a legend in Yoruba, not because of her beauty or her strength, but because she had tamed the wildest part of herself, her tongue. She spoke not to hurt, but to nurture, and in doing so, she became a beacon of wisdom in a world that had once feared her. And so, the girl who had once ruled with her words now ruled with her heart, a heart that had learned the true power of kindness.